Hey everyone, and welcome. I am so excited to jump right into this explainer covering Chapter 1, Introduction to Micro and Macroeconomics. Whether you're tracking your own monthly budget or trying to make sense of crazy global trade headlines, understanding economics is, at its core, simply a matter of changing your perspective. It's about knowing exactly which lens to look through at any given time. And we're going to make that incredibly clear today.
Okay, let's dive right in. When you hear buzzwords like taxes, GDP, demand, supply, monopoly, and consumer thrown around in the media, it can honestly feel like a totally chaotic jumble. But believe it or not, these elements actually form a highly structured, interconnected system. You can kind of think of it as a living, breathing economic organism. And to understand how this organism survives, thrives, or gets sick, we need a really methodical way to examine it.
Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the two lenses of economics. Second, micro, the microscopic view. Third, why micro matters. Fourth, macro, the big picture. Fifth, why macro matters. And finally, micro versus macro. Let's get going.
Section 1, Two Lenses of Economics, Changing Your Perspective.
To really grasp how the economy works, economists look at the world using two very different scientific tools. It's a lot like having a microscope and a telescope. First, we use the microscope to zoom all the way in on the tiny individual components that make up our daily lives. Then, we pack that away, grab a telescope, and pull all the way back to view the vast, entire economic universe. You absolutely need both, but they do completely different jobs.
Moving on to Section 2, micro, the microscopic view, zooming in on the individual.
Historically speaking, microeconomic analysis actually came first. Tracing the origins back, we start in the era of classical economists. We're talking heavy hitters like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and J.S. Mill. But it was truly cemented and popularized a bit later by the neoclassical economist Professor Alfred Marshall. In 1890, he published a hugely influential book called Principles of Economics, and that firmly established the microscopic approach we still rely on today.
Now, what's really fascinating is how brilliantly Professor A.P. Lerner describes this. He suggests that microeconomics consists of looking at the economy through a microscope to see how the millions of cells in the body of the economy play their part. It's literally a biological analogy. He's basically saying that individual households as consumers and individual firms as producers, well, they're like tiny living cells. Microeconomics studies exactly how these individual cells function to keep the whole economic organism working properly. So what exactly are we studying when we look at these individual cells? Well, the scope of microeconomics basically covers three main areas. First up is the theory of product pricing, which explains how the price of the everyday commodities you buy is set by individual consumer demand and individual producer supply. Second, we have the theory of factor pricing, which looks at how rewards like rent, wages, interest, and profit are determined. And finally, the theory of economic welfare, focusing on efficiency in production and consumption. Notice a pattern here? It's all about individual, specific, highly localized behavior.
Which brings us to Section 3, Why Microeconomics Matters, Understanding the Individual Wallet.
Microeconomics has some absolutely incredible practical applications. Primarily, it explains price determination. It literally tells us how the price of your morning coffee or the wages from your job are figured out. But beyond just your wallet, it helps us understand the workings of a free market economy. A free market is simply one where economic decisions, like what to produce, how much to produce, and how to do it, are made purely at the individual level. There's no government intervention at all. It's just the natural interaction of millions of those individual consumer and producer cells making their own choices. Now, that sounds like a perfectly self-regulating system, right? But here is the major plot twist. What happens when the entire economic organism gets sick all at once? Like what happens when millions of totally healthy cells suddenly stop functioning because the environment around them just collapses? Well, economists found out the hard way during the Great Depression of the 1930s. That trusty microscope? It was completely useless for explaining a massive, systemic crash where individual decisions just couldn't save the day. They desperately needed a new tool.
Section 4, Macro, the big picture, grabbing the telescope.
Let's see how this builds historically. To be fair, macro-level thought wasn't entirely new. Back in the 16th and 17th centuries, English merchants known as mercantilists pushed for policies based on a broader macro approach. In the 18th century, French thinkers called physiocrats analyzed national wealth. Even classical thinkers like Adam Smith talked about national income, but they heavily mixed it with microanalysis. Make no mistake, micro absolutely ruled the economics world until that catastrophic Great Depression.
It was the sheer devastation of that era that prompted Lord John Maynard Keynes to publish theories firmly establishing macroeconomics as a crucial, entirely separate discipline. They needed it to understand these massive systemic failures.
So how exactly do we define this telescopic view? Broadly speaking, macroeconomics deals with the functioning of the economy as a whole. It's all about the relationship between large aggregates. We're no longer looking at one person's paycheck or a single company's output. Nope. Instead, we're looking at massive aggregates, total national income, the total volume of employment across the entire country, total savings, and total investments.
Looking at the scope of macroeconomics, it operates on a truly grand scale. It includes the theory of income and employment, which tries to figure out what drives the level of employment across a whole nation. It also studies the determination of the general price level. Remember how micro looked at the price of a single cup of coffee? While macro looks at the average of all prices of goods and services currently being produced. This is what explains the widespread inflation or deflation you might hear about on the evening news.
Section 5. Why macroeconomics matters. Fixing the system.
The real, immense impact of macroeconomics is that it helps us understand the functioning of a massive economic system, complete with all its crazy major fluctuations. According to Keynes, macro is an incredibly policy-oriented science. Governments actively use this toolkit to craft policies that promote economic growth, generate widespread employment, and step in to control disastrous systemic issues like hyperinflation or deep economic depressions. It is literally the toolkit for national survival.
And finally, Section 6. Micro versus macro, the complete picture.
Because the reality is, you simply cannot understand the forest without the trees, nor the trees without the forest. So the crucial takeaway here is grasping the fundamental difference in their meaning. Microeconomics studies the behavior of an individual unit of an economy. Macroeconomics studies the behavior of aggregates, the economy as a whole. One is a singular cell, the other is the entire living organism.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how they compare side by side. Their tools, their scope, and their importance directly contrast with each other. For tools, micro relies on individual demand and supply, while macro uses aggregate demand and supply. For scope, micro zeroes right in on product pricing, while macro scopes out the big stuff like national income. And importance, micro determines business prices, while macro tackles national economic fluctuations. They are truly two halves of the exact same coin.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer, but I want to leave you with a quick question to ponder. As you go about your day, make financial decisions, or just scroll through the news, are you focused on your individual cell or the aggregate whole? Mastering economics means learning to look through both that microscope and that telescope at the exact same time. Knowing when to zoom in and when to pull back will absolutely change the way you see the world. Thank you so much for joining me today to explore these foundational lenses of economics.